Okay. Hey, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. We have a freaking offender here with Bruce Alderman, and I'm super excited today because we dialogued. As some of you may know, on Integral Stage, Layman Pascal did, I think, a really great job in interviewing me about UTOK and what it affords psychology. And I was talking to Bruce and getting his take, and I was like, wow, I really want to dive into your philosophy, your understanding. How do you approach the field? So Bruce, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, really looking forward to talking with you today and to you hanging with Gregg in Vermont pretty soon. So.
Yeah, man, we're looking forward to the meta-modern spirituality. Actually, that's a nice bridge for anybody that wants to hear Bruce's unbelievably rich life history, especially with a spiritual bent. I really encourage the Meta-Modern Spirituality podcast that you did with Brendan. Graham Dempsey. It's a great narrative. So for folks that want more background on your personal journey and your deep, rich perspective on living, let me recommend that podcast.
Oh, thank you.
So today we're going to get you a kind of professional take on what is your approach to psychology. How did you kind of get into it? How do you get trained? And what's your view? And then we'll maybe build some bridges with UTOK. But really, I know you have an enormous, rich perspective embedded in transpersonal psychology and other branches. It's actually a branch in which I'm pretty well versed in psychology, but not super well versed in transpersonal. So I really look forward to getting that take. So why don't we start there and tell us a little bit then about your background in psychology, how you entered in, I think it was master's program, maybe in transpersonal counseling, if I heard that correctly. And we'll start from there and see how this evolves in terms of getting your perspective on this field.
Sure, sounds good. And yeah, I'm hoping we can talk about some correspondences with UTOK as we go through it. But Definitely. I'll be happy to just kind of unpack mostly how I've been approaching it, in my own teaching work and working with students. And I actually increasingly, depending on what kind of class load I'm carrying in the future, I want to begin to introduce students more to UTOK. So I'm intending on that. But yeah, well, I think it'd be nice to explore here what I've been doing so far and what
Lovely.
Our program has been doing so
That'd
far.
That'd be great. Yeah, really. Let's do it. Yes, let's find Bruce's version of what psychology is and its approach to the pragmatics at the level of psychotherapy or wise living or wherever you want to take us. Absolutely.
Sure. Well, yeah, I feel a little bit daunted in that. I'm speaking to someone that I regard as a virtuoso in the field. So I'll be giving you my little snapshot version compared to what you...
Right. Well, the caveat is well placed. Folks, I am a child when it comes to spiritual development. And I'm in a spiritual guru's presence. So we can complement each other, I think, quite well at that level. Okay.
Okay. Well, as part of the narrative I gave to Brendan, and I've talked about it a few other places. I part of my journey involved going over to the East and living there for a number of years. And at first I was just there as an English teacher and dabbling in some meditation and music classes and retreats and things like that.
Right.
But gradually it progressed into, after I finished my main teaching gig in Korea, traveling around in Southeast Asia and in India and Nepal for a number of years, and doing a lot of contemplative training in a number of different traditions and contexts for a number of years. Exactly. And when I returned to the US, I wanted to find a way to integrate that contemplative knowledge with a Western lifestyle and professional path.
Very good.
And it was at that point that I kind of rediscovered Wilber. I had originally come across him before and had liked some of his appreciative but critical reflections on, holographic theory or quantum theory and things like that. But some of his approaches to spirituality previously, before that Asian trip, I had not really resonated with. But after coming back and seeing kind of what he was trying to integrate, and how he was really trying to bring Eastern and Western insight together into a more coherent worldview, world picture. I thought, yeah, there is something here, and I'd like to explore it more. And I couldn't find anything that existed at the time in that, but there was a transpersonal psychology program, actually several of them over
Okay.
here on
Mhm.
the West Coast, and I
Mhm.
settled on the one at John F. Kennedy University.
Okay.
And so I went through the training there where they had some Wilber material as part of
Mhm.
an overall
Mhm.
program in basically in marriage and family therapy, uh, counseling training
Hmm.
with a transpersonal emphasis and
Okay.
some emphasis on Ken Wilber's work. So,
Gotcha.
that whole program, it was definitely, training to be a standard counselor within California for marriage and
Okay.
family therapy,
Uh-huh. Right.
with some focuses on existential issues, family uh, therapy, cognitive behavioral, diagnosis and assessment,
Okay.
uh, pharmacology, all those
Right.
kinds of things.
Right.
Um, but also some classes that open up into consideration of transpersonal type experiences or more integrative lenses on the whole thing.
Right.
And
Can we double click on at least what give folks some understanding of transpersonal psychology? I think, like I said, certainly if they're following the UTOK trail, especially from a standard psychological academic perspective or even an integrative psychotherapy perspective, transpersonal pops up, but it's not one of the big major cognitive behavioral psychodynamic perspectives. So there's certainly if you follow the humanistic tradition, it's pretty clear that this bridge is into it, but it'd be, I think, potentially useful. I think there was some article that was like, hey, there are a lot of different definitions of transpersonal
right.
and a lot of different approaches. So let's give folks a little bit of frame. When you use that term, what's your primary reference?
Ken Wilber actually started out as a transpersonal psychologist, and that's where he was writing initially.
Yep.
From a very early age, and
Mhm.
kind of made a big splash in the scene.
Mhm.
But from the side of transpersonal psychology, they've often framed the development of psychology in terms of four forces,
Mm.
considering transpersonal psychology from within their frame to be the fourth force.
Fourth force. Yep.
A lot of other schools of psychology will not accept transpersonal as the fourth force, right?
Right. Beck tried to label cognitive the fourth force, by the way.
Right.
So there's competition for, by the way, just in case, psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and traditional humanistic approaches are almost always considered, at least within the American psychological tradition, the big three forces. And I think that's almost sort of undeniable in relationship to the influence of American psychology. So who's the fourth force? And yes, so that's cool that transpersonal at least is enough of a place in certain domains like California where it was very salient and influential.
Right. And there are other contenders also, like Stollerow and Atwood. They consider their intersubjective psychology and therapy to be the fourth force. So, there are a number of people who are elbowing each other for
that's
for
right.
that.
We don't have a clear fourth force. Yes.
Exactly.
But I think transpersonal is a good contender.
It is. It has, I think, some stronger proponents and some weaker proponents of it. Not all formulations of transpersonal psychology, I think, have equal standing and coherence and empirical grounding. But there are some that do, and they're basically the idea behind transpersonal psychology. They look to Maslow, and one of Maslow's writings in the 70s, where he was looking at the farther reaches of human nature and noticing that as people moved towards self-actualizing, sometimes that pyramidal peak opened up into a kind of transcendent domain where there were flow states and different, it's not just peak performance, but actual opening into a sense of participating with reality in a fuller way than they'd been able to access just as an ego. And these states sometimes, have been correlated with different types of descriptions from the mystical traditions about our higher potential.
Totally.
And so Maslow was one of the first people, and with Frege and a number of other people at that time, who began to argue that we need to make space in psychology for consideration of higher functional altered states of consciousness and their impact on overall human well-being and functioning, and what they might tell us about human identity, human self-development, human functioning, human well-being.
Perfect.
And that these things need to be considered for a coherent view of full scope human development and psychological functioning. And that there was a concern that because of especially certain behavioral and psychoanalytic influences on the overall and pharmacological influences on the overall field, that sometimes genuinely potentially positively transforming mystical or spiritual experiences were being diagnosed as pathological, or not recognized for their positive self-impactful potential, and instead were misdiagnosed and usually medicated and treated away rather than mined for actual fruitful outcomes.
Totally.
And so there's been some work by transpersonal psychologists to have an impact on the DSM and general formulations about things like spiritual emergency and authentic religious experience,
right,
as areas of potential human experience that should be included in an overall map that generally are not.
Totally. Let me pause you there for just a sec, just to plug right in. I think me and you and John Vervaeke, Zach Stein, Layman, Pascal, there's a real fascinating synergy. So to validate your perspective in terms of some of the blind spots, I did a blog called The 10 Problems of Consciousness, okay? And basically just delineated, and it was a very naturalistic blog, okay? And it situated it essentially, the high problem being the self-conscious reflective issue of persons, okay? And then subconscious issues and all, whatever. But it didn't hit at all on the transcendent. That didn't touch that. And then I'm listening to John, and John, in terms of the awakening the meaning crisis, does quite a bit of attention to at least the issue of transcendence in terms of what he calls the problem of ontonormativity around transcendence, the number of individuals that have these states, what kind are they, how do they evolve into them, and why are they so impactful, and what are they tapping into, and how have we lost sight of that in the Enlightenment? And then my first contact with John and our first little project together was called The 11th Problem of Consciousness. It was 2 blogs we did. And he happened to really tap on this in the Awakening to Meaning series on the 11th episode. And so I used it as saying that I missed the 11th problem in my list of 10. And so we then joined together and delineated some of the dynamics that are associated with, and by the way, a transpersonal, meaning across, above, and beyond the person egoic level into a higher state, as it were. And then what is the spiritual, mystical, human context, ontological, metaphysical, existential elements of all of that. And so just at the level of my own, like I said, yes, I have pretty good mastery of mainstream empirical psychology. I'm historically blind to these issues, maybe not so much in the last 5 to 10 years, but my whole tradition has been blind to them. And so we want to show that I think the transpersonal people are absolutely right. That when Maslow sees above the self-actualization potential into the emergence of a transcendent state, he recognizes that as really crucial. A number of people have, but it hasn't gotten the attention in our modernist Enlightenment worldview as it should. And the transpersonal people are absolutely right about that. And it's super cool that you're, deeply immersed in that and a pioneer in it in some ways.
Yeah, I think that it really is, it's not everything. And there's a kind of a maturation that happened within the field of transpersonal psychology, where initially it was felt that if you access some of these higher states, it was going to magically resolve a lot of the lower issues. And practical experience showed, no, that doesn't happen. There can be positive impacts in terms of lessening of depression and more coherent organization and an expansion of perspective taking capacity, and a lot of things that can happen from genuine deepened contemplative experience, but it was by no means a panacea. So there was, within the field, kind of like in the 70s, there was hope that if you at least got the mystical experience, it could radically reconfigure the self. And for the most part, that doesn't happen. Sometimes there are really deep, profound changes in an individual, but more often than not, it's a process of accessing other dimensions of the self that then have to be very slowly and carefully integrated into your overall functioning.
Lovely.
And it takes a lot of work to do that. But yeah, there's one of the things that happen in transpersonal psychology is, they once Maslow and Frager and Fadiman and a few other people started really focusing on that. Out of the humanist and existential humanist movements, they began to see a need for acknowledging those aspects of human experience. They looked back and saw, while Jung, for instance, early on mentioned the word überpersönlich, superpersonal. James mentioned it, but he was referring more towards kind of the broader social dimensions of consciousness that came into the individual. But there was also Roberto Assagioli, who developed psychosynthesis.
I know that name, but actually I don't know much about him at all in psychosynthesis, just as a comment. I'm where, my knowledge of psychology is, again, decent, but this is an area that I definitely need to look more into.
Yeah, he was really remarkable. He was a kind of a wonder child. He was in Italy. He was basically one of the first people to introduce psychoanalysis into the universities, and he introduced it as a student. He was being taught psychology, as it existed at the time by his professors, but he became very interested in what Freud and Jung were doing and began to talk about that to his professors. And he published, psychology articles at the age of 16, and he spoke like 7 or 8 different languages. And he was a polymath kind of individual.
Fascinating.
But one of the things that's interesting about him is, ultimately, as he developed it, it was largely an existential humanist school, which had some similarities to and resonances with psychoanalysis and analytic psychology of Freud and Jung. But he felt that while analysis broke up, divided the self down and looked at the different things, there was no coherent path towards synthesis.
Right.
Right. And so he felt that really was a kind of a missing aspect of both what Jung and Freud were working on. And he had early on experience and exposure to mystical traditions through his mother, who was a theosophist. And so he was exposed to Advaita Vedanta and some other perspectives there on dimensions of the self that were not part of the justifying self, but were part of more of like a layer of awareness. So he tried to build a psychological model that folded in that layer of the self as basically a locus of awareness and will. That was not the ego, that was not a structure, but was more of a biological function. So anyway, he was kind of he participated in the early, because he was in dialogue with Jung and Freud, and he influenced their work. They acknowledged him as a brother, and they actually took some insights. Some of the Jung stuff looks like it may even have come from Assagioli and not credited. But then he was kind of looked to as an exemplar with the emerging existential humanist movement. And then later, when they felt the need to go towards transpersonal, they looked back to him again and saw that he had actually already been mapping some of that territory
Wow.
and some fruitful ways of working around it.
Great. No, that's really helpful, and it's a very good motivator for me to then do some digestion of psychosynthesis.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worthwhile to engage with it. There are aspects that still remain relevant. He was not a giant self-promoter, and he did not try to create a single absolute system. And as a result, a lot of his innovations and insights got picked up by other people, and they don't even know where they came from.
Interesting. Interesting.
The idea of a subpersonality came from him. The idea of creative visualization as a therapeutic modality, he was the first to be doing it. A lot of different kinds of things like that.
Cool.
So
thank you for that. Yeah, no, that's good to know.
Yeah, so Wilber, entered the scene in dialogue with all of that, and one of his I think initial insights was that because he was practicing, he was in psychoanalysis, he was getting Gestalt therapy, but he was also practicing Zen.
Definitely, right.
And doing some other things, and he could see that all of those things were serving him, and that they all had something to say about his nature and potential. But when he listened to any one of those groups, they all hated the others.
Right. Well, that's the chronic condition of the field.
Exactly right. And I heard your conversation with John where you were talking about eclectic and its place. John was saying, why is that anything to be proud of? And you were saying, well, it's not, but it is a step up from the the exclusivism of the prior traditions. And that's something I've always talked about in my classes as well, is that if you look around and you survey a lot of therapists now, a lot of them do say eclectic, which suggests that no single one of the approaches is necessarily adequate in itself, and that they can be fruitfully engaged. And then the next logical step after that, which of course you very well recognize, is how can they be integrated into some kind of coherent system so that they're not just used in a hodgepodge way, and where it becomes self-undermining pretty much, because there's no way to assess any path forward in a sense. It's just so anyway, there definitely is a need for that kind of integration. And Wilber's initial insight was that they dealt with different layers of the psyche, that the psyche was in strata, and that they could be correlated to different aspects of our evolutionary and biological development and our own psychological unfolding over time as we build up self-structure. So his insight was that a lot of the different modalities are focusing on different strata, maybe more biologically, behaviorally based, or emotional structures, or script structures. So there are different layers that they can be plugged into, and that they all can serve those different things without necessarily conflicting with each other. While recognizing that we still need a kind of coherent ontology behind all of those things. Nevertheless, I think he was right that you could see them as strata. But as he progressed, obviously we know that eventually he began to see that also that strata model was not enough, and that there were at least 4 fundamental perspectives that could be taken on psychology. And actually, it's now really, the full aqua model will point at even more than that. So yeah, that gets up to like typically how I would frame in my classes, what is an integrative approach to psychology. I don't know if there's anything you want to talk about.
Well, we can certainly summarize, and then so in terms of Wilber, so Wilber's tracking the sort of phylogenetic and ontogenetic evolution of consciousness, cognition, cultural awareness, develops the sort of developmental line approach He really delineates that in Integral Psychology, a 2003 book, nicely, and shows, all the multiple developmental structures and the emergence really from sort of a sensory motor into a more perspectival, if you want to use John's language, there's emotionally regulated, and then a more thoughtful, and then expansively thoughtful, and then ultimately spiritual, trans-spiritual view.
Right.
I'm now very much in line with that view. I've got my CAS model of habits and experiences and relational defense justification. In terms of my psyche, I have sort of the organism into animal, animal into mammal, mammal into primate, primate into person, person into spirit. So I'm very much, and I haven't always been that way. I haven't always seen that line that Wilber saw really, really nicely. So I just want to pause and give, props to Wilber's brilliant line view. And then the what I call the epistemological quadrants. I know Wilber would, I think he'd recognize that it's epistemologically emphasis, but he would still see an ontology to it, especially when you tie the lines to it. And I grant that, although I think his ontology is not quite as precise as it might be, certainly from a UTOK goal. But anyway, then you get the, interior, exterior, as folks will likely know listening channel, individual, collective, 2 by 2. That really gives you a framework for understanding a phenomenological epistemology, a behavioral object epistemology, cultural hermeneutic epistemology, and a systems epistemology across the quadrants. And, then you get the Wilber all line, all quadrant view. And is it your sense then, or at least this is where your position sort of is, Wilber is sort of, probably the best representative of transpersonal? Do you see it that way? Or do you see transpersonal and integral, and you then are you kind of really finding yourself as a transpersonal integral, or transpersonal and integral are the same to you because Wilber identifies that way? I'm just kind of curious actually how you position yourself and then bring it to your students about the relationship between integral and transpersonal.
I do differentiate them.
Okay.
Although, Wilber started out as a transpersonalist and he moved away. And I think there are certain strengths, new gifts and new insights that he brought forward with his departure from the transpersonal movement. But I think there's some legitimate pushback from people within the transpersonal community, or legitimate contributions that aren't as well, developed in Wilber's model. Or at least not as significantly emphasized. And so when I talk to students about it, I will, I'll talk about Wilber, but I'll also talk about, Groff and Ferrer and Washburn and a number of other people and what they bring. In addition to what Wilber's emphasizing, Rowan, and there's a bunch of people who are taking transpersonal approaches in one way or another. And they typically are in dialogue with Wilber in some way, but not always in full agreement with him.
And when you're teaching, are you emphasizing consciousness? Are you emphasizing pathology? Are you emphasizing sort of therapy? Is it the intersection of all of that in relationship to the views that you bring and have familiarity and educate in?
Yes, yeah, really all of that. We explore both you could say the upper reaches of consciousness as they've been mapped by Wilber, but also by Groff and other people, and the types of pathologies, the types of issues and problems that might be associated with those mystical experiences. So, for instance, and maybe we could get into that in just a little bit, because I know you're pretty familiar with the Aqua model, so we maybe don't have to focus there a lot. But for instance, it's important to be able to distinguish between spiritual emergence, which is just spiritual experiences emerging for the client but not causing any problems, but they may be areas that are unfamiliar to the therapist. Then there's spiritual emergency, where the emergence of those types of experience and states are actually destabilizing the individual. Then there's psychotic episodes. And then there are mystical experiences with psychotic features, which, if they're identified, can be positively transforming, but often because there's enough of an indicator that there's some kind of psychosis going on here, they can be shut down rather than being allowed to run their course within a safe container. And so there's a lot of thought and work going into, if you can identify that, how can you create the containers for that to run its course?
Right.
Because we have ancient traditions where they're definitely the shamanic crisis and the different kind of mystical transformations that you can see that did result in highly functioning individual on the other side, typically functioning at higher levels than most of their peers. But first they went through a period of significant breakdown and crisis. Totally. From our medical model, typically that's pathologized and we don't let it run its course.
This is really interesting. I'll reflect personally for just a sec on this. What it settled, and I never really had this, it sort of came up when I was doing these blog series with John, but I never put it in this context. And that is in 1997, I situated myself, sort of fell into justification systems theory. I didn't call it that exactly at the time. It's like, okay, and I'm differentiating this person culture layer through justification off of the animal primate. And then I have my stoned experience in August of 1997, and the tree of knowledge pops out. Okay. And that was fundamentally transformative. My life, I can definitely put that date on the calendar. You're like, I changed, something blew out of me, and I've never been the same since. And I went and saw a therapist, and it's 8 months later, and I was already, although I'm fortunate in some ways, because I think I had a transcendent experience that actually grabbed logos, and I was, not just spiritually aware, but really architecturally, logically aware also. So I could be grounded, I think, in some ways, in more than what would be maybe sort of a more pure vision, perspectival, transcendent experience that many people would have. But then I went to a therapist, and he had in retrospect, he just had no clue as to how to deal with me at all. There was no framing of what this was. The way he tried to empathize it was actually invalidating to me in a number of different ways. I left fairly shortly after that. And I just found myself really interested in, and I never put it this way. Yes, I experienced a transpersonal growth moment. I didn't even have a frame, even though I was a doctoral student in psychology, and wouldn't even have any frame of like who would actually help me with this. And now, and this is the first time I'm really putting together, of course, I should have gone seeing a trans person. Not that there necessarily would have been easy to look up in the directory, but this is just in terms of like the relevance for this and the framing of this and the especially kinds of problems that this affords a very clear view on that are essentially blind in most of the other perspectives. And so just from a personal perspective, I can speak to that very clearly based on my own history.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And there's a guy, David Lukoff, who really writes very eloquently about that. And part of it is because he went through a similar kind of experience to that, where he had, when he was younger, he went through a kind of manic episode where he got a whole flood of insights and a whole new way of seeing and talking about the world, and people couldn't relate to the way he was talking about it. He became, now he would say kind of imbalanced towards a kind of over-enthusiastic evangelizing of his new insights, and he ran out.
Really, that can happen,
right? And anyone he approached about it pathologized him and said that they couldn't see anything positively transforming in that. And he recognized that there were some features of that clinically could be classified in a way that could look like a pathology, but that overall, on balance, it actually was a positively transforming thing for him. And that even though he sounded a little crazy in the beginning, it was all this flood of insight that was reorganizing him, and allowed him to speak in kind of a mythical and metaphorical language, that it was able to encapsulate his insights into clear pictures, and that there was no container for this. And so that he's really been working since then to make carved space in psychology that we can see that there are these kinds of transformative experiences that reorganize the psyche and often show up in mythopoetic language, and that kind of thing. Charged symbol systems that basically
like gardens and trees, like
right.
does it turn into gardens and trees, especially in the
That
Western
lead
tradition?
to new forms of language, right?
Like you talk in a different way?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It happens.
Exactly.
Oh my. Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, so in terms of when you bring your students in, is this then the epicenter of what it is that you're bringing to bear on them? I mean, and I'm just thinking about the weighting of this is super interesting. And at the same time, if I think about the majority of clients that like come in the door, the majority of clients come in the door, at least from my vantage point, are, the neurotic, internal critic, judging self. Certainly we want to, I think the traditional field underemphasizes spirituality, this particular aspect of the human experience. But in terms of, I'm also curious, clearly that's an area of sort of expertise and richness and development here. How does then the juxtaposed everyday concerns of, oh my gosh, I've got an internal critic and I yell at myself and I judge myself and I'm worried and I'm self-conscious and I wish I could get rid of this, also, do you bring a transpersonal view to that kind of set of concerns?
Yes. Yeah. Typically, we have used, and I have used, variations on an object relational self-psychology model in order to talk about different levels of functioning and adaptation and characteristic defenses, basic, emotional landscapes, and relationship types that you can expect to be associated with different levels or layers of object relational development. And so, in this program, we would look at, and we definitely emphasize that the majority of the people that you deal with are going to be, dealing with basically either some strongly prepersonal or layers of prepersonal wounding and fixation, borderline issues, narcissistic issues, things like that, or personal Oedipal, neurotic type issues. We're going to basically have most people who walk in the door, if they come to us as a transpersonal or an integral therapist, it might be that they have some interest in spirituality, but that's probably not going to be the main organizing thing for them.
I gotcha.
But
so
you need to be
just so people are clear. So in the context of the psychoanalytic tradition, I offer the following basic map. So you get Freud, then you get Jung, then you get the neo-Freudians, or like Adler and Horney and Erik Erikson. And then out of Freud, you're also getting sort of a bridging or development of four major traditions. You get the classic drive with its focus on unconscious. You get an emergence of an ego psychology with people like Anna Freud and Heinz Hartmann. You get an object relations out of, say, Melanie Klein into Otto Kernberg. And then you get the emergence of self-psychology, most famously with Kohut. And so object relations and self-psychology are part of sort of a relational reconfiguration of classic psychoanalysis, or a relational emphasis, some of which goes very deep in the object relational world, especially if you follow Melanie Klein, deep as in sort of like the layers of consciousness and the emergence of individuation and really with self-psychology, you kind of get a bridge, I would argue, between sort of a humanistic view of the self and a psychoanalytic view of the self. At least that's one way to read Kohut. So just to give folks a little bit of mapping where an object relationship, self-psychology, and then by the way, Stoloff would be then an intersubjective viewpoint on psychoanalysis in this kind of landscape or map of these schools of thought.
Exactly. That's right. And that's pretty much how we present it. We give them readings by Horney and Adler and, all of these people, but not only focusing on that, that's actually one kind of strand for looking at it. There's also an emphasis on the humanistic and the existential. So there's a lot of discussion of Rogers and of Bugenthal and different, all of their approaches. And yeah, there's a couple ways to maybe frame this. I would say, just for most abstract because for looking at how this relates both to everyday psychological functioning and potential spiritual states.
Lovely.
Would be to look at our layers of identification. And, again, this is not, it's not super clinically useful, but as a very, very background kind of picture.
You mean like layers of human identity?
Yes, exactly. Right.
Sweet, man. Yeah. Now you're talking my language. I just held up the UTOK coin, which I toured Bruce through, and he's and so anyway, with its human identity function, couldn't help but make the reference. Please proceed, Bruce.
Yeah, no, love it. Love it. Yeah. We can look at it as early infants. We're mostly immersed in the world of the body. We're not clearly differentiating the body as an object.
Right.
And so we're subject to it. And whatever its states are basically is world for us, right? Gradually through object relational dynamics, and you can look at it from a number of different lenses, but we gradually differentiate a body ego. We're able to make it into object. We're able to actually increasingly use it intentionally, make it subject to will and to purpose and intentionality. Control our bodily functions, all of that. But then we tend to be immersed in our emotional self, and our emotional self is merged with others. There's not a clear differentiation of my needs, your needs, my wants, your wants. It's all a soup to us. Going through the rapprochement and the terrible twos, that's the period in which we begin to notice an emotional disjunction between my states and the other states. And that creates all of the dynamics of the terrible twos of us, approach and retreat dynamics and all of those things. But it's an important phase of differentiation where we begin to be able to make emotions into object. At first we're splitting, but it gradually, if we're held in a space that can hold our splitting states, then we're allowed to be able to eventually integrate them. And not identify in one or the other side. Failures in either of these stages from at least some schools of thought can lead to certain propensities towards psychopathology, different kinds of psychosis, different kinds of maybe autistic issues, but it's not only developmental. There's also physical causes. But also, different attentional styles, different defensive styles, different fixations that result in borderline or narcissistic or other types of personality disorder. They can all be associated with incomplete or disrupted transitions at these phases of development.
Right.
But
I don't know if I was hearing this, but it felt almost like kind of a Keegan model, a little bit of subject-object movement. Do you use Robert Keegan's model much in relationship to kind of framing those developmental phases? Obviously, I'm hearing also maybe some Piaget, and of course, Wilber himself is really a developmental theorist in a very deep and profound way. But it just seemed like there was a Keegan, emphasis perhaps for you in there. I don't know.
Yes, there is in the subject-object toggling, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, right. And so often, just as the general frame, we then, if we make that transition, and we become at least stable enough in our relationship to our own emotional states, and able to make them into enough of an object that we achieve a level of development that is roughly what's expected by our society. But then we end up largely identified with our thinking selves.
Right.
And we're not, so then we're identified with the mental self, and we're not typically able to make a clear distinction between content and process, and between what I think about myself and my own identity. Those things are mixed up and not clearly differentiated.
Nice.
Cognitive behavioral approaches and other approaches will help you begin to identify, different forms of irrational thinking and all of that. And then mindfulness practices can actually help you become even more fully aware of our propensity towards identification with thought as self,
Yep.
and to basically disembed from that.
Lovely.
So there's an idea that, that's a kind of a transitional thing that we're working on. We're typically, for the average adult, we need to typically do some excavation work to go back and deal with wounds at the prepersonal levels and the personal levels. Make those things into object, deal with the different kinds of emotional wounds and fixations, but also do the work that increasingly we can become more mindful of our own thought patterns and basically adjust our thinking patterns to more adaptive ones. But beyond that, also be able to see our identification with thinking as basically a limited abode of identification that's not necessary for our own actual identity and well-being. And that spiritual disciplines can help with that reorientation.
Wow. Yeah. So this is why there's so much real convergence now, and in my own limitations is blind to this, but now as UTOK comes online, it affords me. So just to line it up. So, the psyche is a body, then it becomes an animal with feeling, and then becomes a mammal with a mind's eye. And then it's operating at a perceptual emotional level. And then it begins to extend that over time, creates relational dynamics, individuates, gets some mastery of symbolic, and then into justification, emerges as an ego. That's your thinking stuff. And that's where you kind of expect, ego, primate, or ego self, experiential self relation. But what we actually also then need to do is to continue to develop that metacognitive observer, that affords the capacity from a psychological mindfulness perspective to be able to step outside and identify what's going on. And I would argue sort of afford sort of the logos narrator, make sense of self, make sense of ego, make sense of the persona world. And I would also then say what the meditative practice do is grab a hold of that witness awareness function, and recognize that identification with that gives you a pre and trans justificatory egoic position, and centering yourself in relationship to that affords you a detachment from the way the self ego persona gripping function of this is the way it's got to be, and oh my God, and and it's like, hey, the world is, and there's a way to sit in that and even back into nirvana potentially at a pre-trans meditative perspectival level, and that was blind to me from a regular mainstream empirical psychological view in the West. There's nothing in relationship to that. But now, where I am, it's like, oh, that's as obvious, as the nose on my face in relationship to the processes and structures of the psyche. So it's really fascinating. I'm just confessing my own limitation and then growth into this perspective, say over the last 10, 15 years. It's really fascinating to see it from that perspective, and then to feel so joined and so readily able to hear what it is that you're laying out there.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I one reason, of course, that I've wanted to talk to you about that is that as I listen to you, of course, I feel a lot of resonance with what you're exploring and opening up, and so I wanted to basically, share with you and riff with you on these different perspectives as I've been approaching it, because I know I have a lot to learn from you, but I think you also would appreciate, kind of the territory that in its own way, and I think it is still incomplete and developing, but has really pushed into territory that I think is useful and meaningful, and that's going to be increasingly valuable to us going forward.
Totally. And I really think you have this whole trans-Eastern, into spiritual, values-based perspective. And then you have this behavioral, natural science view. And if we pay attention to the Enlightenment gap, inside the West, we don't know how to put matter and mind together, science and subjectivity together, and the social construction of knowledge. Now maybe we can. And now if UTOK is like able to come around and get the third person, big picture, big history view with the tree of knowledge, okay, and then sees that it needs the placeholder for the iQuad coin, and then says, well, that placeholder, if we go to yogic sciences, meditative practices, Wilber's fundamental insights and bridging, and then see the organism into animal, into mammal, into primate, into person, into transpersonal spiritual stack inside and out, now we're really, oh my God, you actually have a natural science perspective behaviorally from the outside in, and that can now align very clearly with a lot of the psyche perspectives that were subjectively, enriched by the Eastern, which didn't shackle themselves to say, well, you got to be able to observe it from the outside. You're going to make it a science. I mean, that's what modern empirical science did. But then that broke the connection between outside in, inside out. And I think we're about ready to put that connection right back together.
Right. Yeah, that's super exciting. Yeah, so in kind of holding these things alongside each other, of course, I've taught in multiple different programs. I should say, though this is both a badge of honor and probably a detriment as well, I'm probably the first person to graduate with an integral psychology degree.
You mean like in the country?
In the country, in the world, probably.
Really? Oh my God, that's fascinating. I in this day and age, as integral circles back, and we're in a post metaphysical age, and we're leading the integral stage. I think it's a hell of an honor, Bruce. So let me say, at least for now, that's a hell of an honor. And it's a brilliant thing. It's a beautiful thing, and I'm been so enriched by your story and your insights. So I certainly want to honor that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I say it's a detriment because obviously the field was just being born at the time, so I'm kind of one of the early guinea pigs,
Right. Well,
but so I've taught in the transpersonal psychology program. I taught in an integral psychology program, and now I currently teach in a consciousness and transformative studies program. So in each one of those, this has been held differently. In the transpersonal psychology program, the big focus is on counseling psychology, and it's through taking you through the full scope of human development and all the different kinds of treatment modalities that are important for all of the levels of our functioning. Integral psychology focused on that, but less on the counseling side and more on the theoretical side. Consciousness and transformative studies situates the psychological within a broader picture of philosophical and spiritual and ecological concern.
Great. Yeah, it's wonderful. It sounded interdisciplinary, but yeah.
It is. So, that's right. That's one of the things that's excited me about, for instance, some of John's recent talks, where he's been with Blundell and others, where, we talk about integral psychology and spiritual practice and philosophy and meta theory in relationship to things like big history and psycho-ecological approaches and things like that.
I think you and I have listened to both of those conversations, or the series of conversations you had lately, and think, we got a lot of resonance there. We're seeing the cosmos outside in and the psyche inside out, and finding that resonance is really and John's definitely hooking up with people that are, mostly recently seeing the big history evolutionary view, and that's linking to his, recursive relevance realization, which really does situate him in a phenomenological view. Although of course he's a scientist in that regard, but is that interrelation. We can go around the quadrants. It's like, hey, can we have like a prepositional relationship between the quadrants as we move around them? I don't know if we could only develop a grammatology in relationship with that. Do you have anything to say about that, Bruce?
I'm working on it.
All right. And if you could connect with somebody who understands adjacency, then we'd be in really good shape.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was thinking, I don't know what's most fruitful to talk about. I would say one thing, like a basic framing of, when I present integral psychology generally, I would say that there are a number of principles. This is, especially influenced. I mean, Mark Foreman is taking Aqua, but he, formulated it in a pretty nice way. But basically, an integral psychological approach. I want to say what that is, and then I want to maybe look at some transpersonal things that complement that, or that fill in some other gaps.
Okay.
So transpersonal, for an integral psychological approach, one, you recognize that it recognizes that there's at least 4 overarching ways to approach the life of your client.
Okay.
So one is the interior, the intersubjective, and the intentional. Basically the inside and the inside out kind of point of view. where you want to look at what's going on in terms of their mind states and their self-development and things like that. Of course, then you want to look at the behavioral and the biological, and look at what's going on in their lives in terms of their habitual behaviors, their some of their things like diet. There's a whole range of things that you can look at in terms of their adaptiveness of their behaviors and their physical condition. Then there's the cultural and the familial, and all their different kinds of shared meaning spaces and the the interpersonal relations of the family dynamics. And then of course there's the the social systems, socioeconomic and systems approaches. And so the feminist and different models there. So there's a whole range of psychological schools that tend to focus on one or the other. Integral recognizes all of them, of course, as legitimate lenses that we can take on the client's life, and that you can use it. Typically, in integral psychotherapy, you're not putting the quadrants up front in your actual interactions with the client. They may never be mentioned.
Right.
But in the background, you're thinking about, what am I looking at?
Yep.
What domains are there to check into? And somebody's, reporting sudden emergence of depressive patterns or something like that. If you don't have that kind of like broad overview background, you might just focus in on the emotional causes of that and the relationship causes of that. You might never ask about, what's going on with the change in their diet, or what's going on, socioeconomically for them, or are they plugged into, power relationships that are, all kinds of things that you can look at. So it's a kind of self-checking thing for the therapist as well, to make sure that you are not missing important areas of the client's life. So all of that. So then you would say, you also recognize, an integral approach also recognizes that the level of self-development of the individual and of the therapist is going to influence the therapeutic encounter. And so you want to understand relatively how developed they are, because the kind of interventions that you make, the kind of defenses that they're going to deploy, the kind of language that you can use, the kind of interpretations that you can make, all of those things are going to be influenced by their level of development. And your own ability to resonate with them is also going to be limited or empowered by your own degree of development.
Love it.
Sometimes we have people walk into the office who are more advanced than us, right? Along certain lines. They may have been, right? And so those things are important to consider, right? So then the integral approach also recognizes that there's not only self-system development, but there are all kinds of intelligences that we have that may be developed in different ways, and they tend to be unevenly developed.
Right.
So it's a good idea to try to get a sense for the general territory of the individual. They might be cognitively very developed, but emotionally or interpersonally or sexually underdeveloped. So you want to look at values lines, kinesthetic development, aesthetic development, all kinds of different capacities that they may have, because it'll give you a better sense of what's going on for them. Again, where you can meet them. Sometimes, if they're lagging in certain areas but highly developed in others, often their problems are associated with the tension between those, and they may even be defensive about looking at those areas that are underdeveloped, right?
Sure.
So you can lead with their own strengths. If you can tune into and identify where they're strongly developed, then you can usually use that as an avenue to loop back and help show them from the strengths of this position why this is important, right?
Right. Nice. Right? Yes.
So there's a need to, get a general sense of the lines of development that are in play.
Right.
There's also recognition that different altered states can impact functioning, and to check in, with if they have any experiences of, not necessarily even things that are intentionally induced, but sometimes just happening for them.
Okay.
What kinds of state experiences are they having? And can certain positive altered states be induced in therapy or in conjunction with therapy that can help with maybe loosening certain kinds of fixations or providing new insights, things like that. So in the West, I used to joke to the students that we normally train in the waking, the sleeping, and the drunk states. Those are the three that we practice. But now the stoned is the fourth one that we're practicing.
Yeah.
But I've lived in other countries, where altered states they have a much richer palette of states that are available and that are regularly accessed even on a dime, that we have no way of dropping into except by chance or by drugs or some other means. But there are cultures that are well practiced in entering into different states, and those states do different things. Anyone who has had deep meditative experiences or psychedelic experiences knows that it's not all pathological, that real genuine insights can happen, real openings around our own fixations can happen, and that working with states, it's not the only thing, it's not the most important thing always, but it's an important piece of it.
Right. Talking about like gross and causal and subtle kinds of states. Do you use that kind of frame?
We do use that language, but not only that. But flow states and different transpersonal theorists will use different kinds of labels for the different kinds of states that are available. I'll come back to that part. Then the last is just that there are different styles of knowing, that we have personality types. We have, of course, the big five, which you've been talking about, and there are the different defensive strategies and different ways of coping and adapting and interpreting that are associated with those. Or you could use something like the Enneagram. But there are also, culture, gender, all of those things influence our ways of knowing. And Beck was kind of big on that in terms of like learning the different codes. He talked about how do you enter into a cognitive behavioral dialogue with somebody who uses the code of the South versus the code of the Northwest, in terms of the values and the things that they appeal to, and what kind of languages and what kind of interpretations that they will most likely resonate with. Basically that's the idea, is that we can look at all of those things for a fairly robust way of interacting with clients and showing up in the therapy room, and checking ourselves to make sure that we aren't basically privileging certain perspectives because of our own dispositions and missing important pieces of the picture.
Right. It's clear. So the integral quadrant, lines, state, styles, stage kind of structure really obviously informs you. And I became really impressed with that. My friend Andre Marquis, as a leader in kind of bridging integral thought to the world of psychotherapy and ways of integrating it and bringing coherence, especially through the epistemological frames and then the lines along those lines. And then he did some research and recognized the importance of states and state fluctuation in psychotherapy and bringing that. So that's really shining through to me, is that your framing is this sort of comprehensive integral. It's really cool to hear the way you bring that to bear and then reference that against more traditional or different lines of transpersonal thought, and then other kinds of more traditional things like cognitive behavior therapy. That's that for me, at least, brings a lot of resonance, a lot of comprehension, a lot of good checks, a lot of ways to be holistic and systematic in the framing of the work that you do.
Right. And there, a lot of integral is like a meta frame, right? And so, as a meta frame, it's not a theory itself, it's a meta theory, right? And so it's a means of integrating different theories, but there are certain insights that are growing out of the integral framing itself, and some of its different emphases. For instance, the focus on perspectives. And, Elliot Ingersoll is a therapist who's been working with that. But one of the things that he looks at is how we can look at the perspective taking, perspective holding, to get a further insight into the psychodynamics of the client. And for instance, how are they using first person, second person, or third person languages, and what are the likely insights that you can get into the individual based on their perspectival style and the choice of language, or the things that they're able to look at or not look at. And I was able to, I had already kind of had that insight in dealing with my my sister-in-law, who lives with us. She came over from her country, Nepal, to help us when my son was first born. And my wife had a little bit of a difficult birth, and so she came over to be with us and kind of help out. But while she was with us, her son was murdered by Maoist rebels.
Wow.
Yeah, and that really obviously devastated her. He was 17 years old and just axed in the street by these Maoist rebels. And so it devastated her, and she ended up staying with us. But she'd been through a number of tragedies already, and then that was a really big one. And she threw herself into work, and worked, 80 hours a week typically. And I didn't see her very much, but I remember one day, she asked for a ride to work, and I drove her, and I was talking to her, and she almost stayed exclusively in third person language, talking about her life and about reality. And I could really feel how she was making a coherent third person picture to help her cope, but that was keeping her very distant and insulated from actually second and first person relating to God, her conception of God, or to herself, and to the wounds that she had sustained.
Gotcha.
So anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but I think there's there are more and less sophisticated ways to work with that, but Elliot Ingersoll is developing some, for instance.
Cool. Yeah, that actually, so what I'm hearing at least is that the framing sort of the human condition, the way it affords a holistic meta perspective to organize others, the way you would then check yourself and begin to understand certain kinds of challenges really becomes pretty clear. Then that got me into sort of like, do you feel like in terms of the active intervention side, when you're thinking about, okay, what am I going to do to leverage myself towards change, to address particular problems? Are you bringing an integral transpersonal view to that? What kind of, is there an active part of you? Is it more, hey, I want to really build a rich conceptualization, and then that affords all sorts of different possible ways, not necessarily procedural sort of active interventions, but a lot of exploratory, a lot of guide. How do you think about sort of the active intervention side of counseling?
Yeah, typically the integral model and the transpersonal model both, because the transpersonal includes the prepersonal up to the transpersonal, and even with Groff, something like the perinatal. And I know that that's a bit controversial, but there is growing evidence for it, in terms of the fact that the infant is an experiencing being prior to birth, and that the state of the womb, the chemical conditions of the womb, the state of the mother's emotional well-being or not, all of those things already are laying a psychic imprint on the child. It's not like our memories and or our self formation suddenly turns on once we're in breathable oxygen.
Sure, absolutely.
It's already happening, right? So, that's something that Groff emphasizes that Wilber hasn't emphasized, but that his holotropic therapy and other things tends to bring out, or the LSD therapy has tended to bring out, is recollections in people of perinatal type experience, and the echoes that has had throughout life. So yeah, looking at those things, basically trying to determine the self-system development, where are they still defensively operating more from a pre-personal position, or a personal one, and is it a relatively neurotic, immature personal one, or is it more mature personal or egoic stage, where they're then going to be probably leaning more into existential questions, and taking stock of the whole life. So yeah, basically looking at that and then focusing on interventions based on that level of function, the level of adaptation, the types of defenses that are deployed. Different interventions will be used. So we definitely talk a lot about the long haul of work that's going to be required if you're dealing with anybody who has pre-egoic issues. Those are not going to be resolved easily. And so it's going to take, different types of intervention, which is typically mirroring and helping to build self-structure. That's kind of cohosts kind of insight. What kind of interventions will you do with the other? First, to mirror them in a way that they actually can possibly feel seen, in a way that they've never felt seen before, and through that begin to both mirror and then deliberately fail to mirror in order to help them develop self-structure, right? So that's, if they're more at a personal level of development, then you're going to be, helping them work with and manage anxiety and depression and different things like that. There may be some cognitive behavioral approaches that are merited depending on the types of thoughts or conceptual fixations that they have. Are they moving into, again, kind of the more existential, deep, meaning of life kinds of question? And somebody like Bugenthal's inward searching, something like that might be more useful for the individual to help them really deeply. They have enough interior agency that they don't need you as an intervener. They need you as a space holder for them to do their own inquiry process.
Lovely.
Right? So there's just, looking at the whole scope of that, where somebody might need, very, very active hand holding and behavioral management, all the way up to just space holding, for them to do inward process and all of that in between.
Nice.
Yeah.
When you, I'll ask one question and then a follow-up, which may bridge us into another domain. When you use that sort of pre-personal, does that align pretty close to what personality disorders? Does that, and then my follow-up question is, where's the DSM for you in this world? And what's your take on that? How useful is that? How much you're informed by it? How much are you a critic of that? What's your relationship to sort of the emergence of the DSM approach to psychopathology? So first, how much does pre-personal align with your view of sort of personality disorders relative to not so much? And of course, this can be on a continuum, obviously, but as I hear that, I wondered. And then as you move from there, maybe you can offer some reflections on the DSM.
Yeah, that's typically how I've done it. Is one, because in our program we're required to teach the DSM.
Okay.
And even though the DSM-5 has made some maybe interesting innovations, there's also some things that it seems it's less clear and useful. So in my classes, I've used the DSM-4 framing more than 5 in terms of understanding at least some of the general markers for personality disorders. And I think the pre-personal is not limited to certain set labeled personality disorders, but typically that's what I've talked to my own students about identifying. Is do they clearly demonstrate, say, 5 or more of these characteristics in their style of relating with you.
Right, right.
And, if you're seeing those basically, defenses and adaptive styles and their modes of relationship with you and communication, if those things are regularly checked off, it's more likely that you're dealing with somebody with at least an emotional fixation at a prepersonal level, and that they're going to be benefited mostly by active mirroring work more than more directive kind of work that you could do with somebody who's better able to manage their own emotions and their own identity.
Gotcha.
And for me, the DSM is definitely a flawed thing, and I'm very cautious about the use of the DSM to label and fixate people.
Right. Put them in categories and be done with them.
Exactly. To pathologize them. The way I've taught it is to use it as another useful lens for checking in while trusting your own instinct and everything else. Because there's usually identified certain clusters of behaviors and patterns that it can be useful for identifying. But it's just like the developmental stages in integral theory. Don't make people into those things. Don't make people into these categories. They can be useful lenses for possibly crafting your language and communication styles and things that you want to look for, and modes or methods that you want to try out and see how they stick. So I think that's I encourage a provisional holding of that. I've already mentioned that it's not very adequate for dealing with the transpersonal.
It is woefully inadequate, I think, would probably be the best only way to characterize it. It's just absent. I mean, it's completely like, huh?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so that might be one. I know we're close to our time here for the hour and a half, but if it's useful to talk a little bit about the spiritual emergency part.
That's that's exactly what I was hoping for. So we're totally on. If we can, let's go into this domain, and then we'll find a way to summarize. It's been a really rich tour, but I definitely wanted to get there.
Cool. Okay. All right. Yeah. So, one of the things that transpersonal and integral psychology both are looking at is, while they're not that common, and it's, again, as a practicing psychotherapist, it's definitely not the big focus, but it's important to have that knowledge from an integral or a transpersonal point of view. There are spiritual emergencies, which the Stan and Christina Groff have done the most work in articulating. But there are also, from the contemplative traditions themselves, all kinds of things, and actually Jungian and other tradition, all kinds of things that can go wrong for the individual as they explore altered states and go through contemplative training. And there are different kinds of things to look for as pathologies, that and fixations and different kinds of things that can happen at those levels of development and self-experience. So as I mentioned before, spiritual emergence is what you typically look for if you're going through any kind of deep inquiry practice or contemplative training. You're looking for increased insight into self and world and maybe some expansion of perspective. And that's spiritual emergence. But sometimes, either through practice and sometimes spontaneously, spiritual type experiences can emerge in a way that proves to be destabilizing for the individual. And it can be destabilizing for a couple reasons. One is that they just don't have a framework for it. And so they're afraid of what might be happening because there's no language and frame that holds those things. And when they speak about it to others, others tend to either say, huh, or to pathologize it. Right? And so that's relatively easy to work with. right?
Mm.
You can help if you're versed in it. You can
If
help
you,
give right give a framework that normalizes what's happening, and that additional cognitive space, is often enough for the person to then be able to not let those experiences overwhelm them, and to integrate and move on, right?
Right,
Um,
right.
Sometimes the individual lacks the emotional or physical or other kinds of resources to deal with the emerging unexpected types of experiences. And then they can destabilize and the self can start to fragment.
Okay.
And so in those cases, you need more active therapeutic intervention, not just giving a cognitive framework, but you might need to, do emotional work with them, do some, cognitive behavioral therapies with them. You might have to make interventions that are designed at grounding them, or telling them to back off of certain spiritual practices,
Okay.
until they can stabilize. So there are a bunch of different things that you can do depending on what's happening for the individual,
Okay.
right? So if you want to see if if it is a spiritual emergency and you're not dealing with something else, then you want to kind of do a differential diagnosis. One of the things that transpersonal therapists and integral therapists will do is if somebody's presenting with some unusual altered state experience, for instance, is actually ask for a medical checkup or some blood work to be done to make sure that there's not like a
brain tumor or something.
Yeah, exactly. You want to make sure that physically they're healthy, right? So sometimes that might be a excess of caution, but depending on how litigious the state you live in is,
sometimes requires an excess of caution. Yeah.
Right. So that kind of thing, you want to encourage that, but then looking for, is it a case of spiritual emergency? Is it a case of a psychotic break, or is it a case of maybe mystical or spiritual experience with some psychotic feature, right? So typically for spiritual emergency, it tends to be accompanied by alterations in perceptions and experiences, that may have a mythopoetic or a transpersonal flavor to them.
Okay.
Where they're we didn't really go over that, but there are different kinds of altered state and spiritual experiences that people can have on a mystical level, of subtle state experiences of visionary or light forms, or experiences of opening into emptiness, or experiences of oneness, different kinds of things that can be happening for people where they feel deeply identified with other people or beings, in a way that it feels like a kind of communion happening. But there could be an entangling of, you're not sure if this is my feeling or their feeling, and so those kinds of things can happen. And if the person is basically able to see this as an internal process, and able to form a therapeutic relationship with you without paranoia and without like undue defensiveness, and it doesn't look like anything going on, physically with them, then probably safe to treat it as spiritual emergency, and to work with them in that regard. If it's psychosis, of course, you want to look for the normal markers. Are there hallucinations? Is there conceptual disorganization or thought blocking? Are there any kind of delusions? Is there disorganized behavior or catatonia? So you're looking for all those things, right?
Sure.
For mystical experiences with psychotic features, typically you would be looking at something like, if the person shows up with maybe some kind of reported exalted kind of affective experiences, a sense of newfound knowledge, a sense of like having a download of sudden kinds of profound insights. They may have delusional sounding language, but it tends to be more metaphorical, and that if you tune into it, it actually is still meaningful. Right? whereas in psychotic break, it's actually disjointed and it doesn't really hang together, right? There could be all kinds of leaps and things that it doesn't, it's not coherent.
Gotcha.
But there tends not to be paranoia with the mystical experience with psychotic features. There tends not to be any conceptual disorganization. And so then, so typically it's the exalted states, the sense of newfound knowledge. There's alterations in perception. They might be having, they might be seeing lights, or they might be seeing things in a certain visionary form. They might be feeling bliss running up and down the body, different kinds of altered experiences of their own reality. And again, if there is delusional sounding speech, it's often highly mythopoetic, dealing with themes of like light and darkness, of world transformation, of new orders of reality, or rewriting history, or those kinds of things. Those, they might go to the extreme where actually the person almost feels like stuck for a while in a kind of dreamlike experience where they're really living this alternate reality and speaking in terms of it. But it can be dealt with in a way that doesn't shut them down and doesn't turn off the experience. Especially if you have certain kinds of indicators. For instance, are they, is it a fairly acute precipitation of these events? Is it within the last 3 months? Prior to that, have they been able to have stable relationships and hold down a job and actually develop themselves? Right? Are they able to see this as an object? Are they able to actually have, some observing ego, where they can see this as a process that's going on and be positively disposed towards working with it? If it's been going on for longer than 6 months, typically that's an indicator that it's not going to be positively transforming. They've actually gotten lost somewhere. And you're going to need to do more serious and probably, maybe even pharmacological interventions and things like that. But 3 months or sooner, transpersonal therapist or integral therapist would say, maybe hold off on
that's a good time frame suggestion. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So that's the kind of the basic idea. And then there's like also like regression in the service of transcendence versus something like schizophrenia. Both often schizophrenia can have a kind of a bleak affect state or a flat affect state.
Blunted.
Yeah. Or a disjunction between how they're showing up in terms of the feeling state and what they're talking about. There's no integration in that. Right. Whereas regression in the service of transcendence, they can also have a bleak type of experience, but at the same time, it's often punctuated by exalted types of experience. It can fluctuate between bliss and dismay. And there's not typically, again, that the kind of incongruence or disorganization that you can see with schizophrenia. And yeah, so again, there's a whole number of things that you can look at for that. But
that really, that really helps, frame. And is it? I'm kind of curious as you. When you're in a community of transpersonal integral psychologists and counselors and whatnot, is it this felt sense that these kind of concerns of spiritual emergencies, when people are looking for counselors of that regard, present themselves fairly regularly? I mean, if you're a transpersonal psychologist, is it your sense that 1 out of every 3 clients, or there's a real regular connection between the work that we do? People can be seen and find us. There's enough of this that's out there that, people like me that have their thing that would, in California or in the old, in the various areas they go, and this becomes definitely a clear subset of the work of the therapy that's fairly prominent and regular. And is that, I guess that's just my question to you, is that show up quite a bit? Because it certainly shows up in our work. definitely. But because of our attention and they don't bring it in, it's not super salient in terms of it pops up periodically, but not with a high degree of regularity. So our spiritual emergencies, would you say, or your sense that they're presenting themselves to people who identify as transpersonal psychotherapists pretty regularly because of that connection?
I would say possibly transpersonal therapists see it more often, mainly because there's an invitation to even bring it up.
Right, that's true.
Right? And there's I think a fear in other contexts, a lot of, both.
Well, the whole spiritual, trance dimension is really missed in a lot of places. So the absence of looking and asking is going to prevent one from seeing.
A lot of our program is actually attracting students who themselves went through something.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And were shut down, or shamed, or not. Yeah.
Right. Not seen at all.
Not seen at all. And so I don't think, again, it's not super prevalent. Transpersonal therapist, mostly you're not going to be dealing in your office with transpersonal issues. Even people who are deeply spiritually oriented, they often still will come in and talk about, man, I really hate my job, or she really effed me over. That's still a lot of what shows up. So it's not.
Well, that's the business of being a verbal, Bruce.
Yeah. Right.
Right. But no, okay. Yeah. But still, to have a frame for it, to be clear about it, to have organized, to ask about it, to see it, it's clearly a crucial part of the human experience. And it's an underdeveloped part of our Western modern experience. And so that's another key element of that in terms of certainly, hopefully, if we come through the meaning crisis, a crucial part will be to cultivate this aspect of our being in the world, being in relationship to each other, being in relationship to oneness, etc.
Right. And I think as more and more people, and especially if we're building something like a religion that's not a religion, that is encouraging wider use of different psychotechnologies, we have to be prepared for what can go wrong in those things.
Yes, totally.
And the traditions are, not perfect, but they definitely are aware of those things. For instance, there can be manic type or episodes or certain kind of psychotic breaks that can happen as the result of intensive meditation. There can be psychic inflation where there's a certain kind of influx of spiritual insight, and then the ego identifies with that rather than being able to critically distance itself from that. And there's a huge narcissistic inflation around that. There are different kinds of fixation that can happen in terms of, certain practices train you to see reality as disgusting in order to break your attachment to it, but you can actually get stuck there. Too intensive focus on mindfulness again and again in the moment can lead to something that the Tibetans call soklung, and it leads to a feeling of agitation, of agitated energy running through the body, and kind of uncontrollable fast thoughts. That happened to me when I was in Indonesia, and I didn't know about soklung at that time, but that's exactly the state I ended up in when I was really, really intensively trying to hold awareness to every single moment. And I ended up with an overwhelming kind of a flood of energy and anxiety through the body. So now I recognize later that that's what the Tibetans call soklung, and it's basically an imbalance in an implied, in the application of a certain technique. So there's a whole range of different things that can happen in terms of some of them are pathologies, or some of them are just incomplete carrying forward of a process. That I think it's worth knowing about. Again, it's not going to show up every day, but the more that we are training people to actually develop these other aspects of themselves, the more that we need to know about what can go wrong in those areas.
Lovely. Well, I'm really glad we did enter into at least a framing of the spiritual emergencies as you see them in various flavors and the ways in which we can attend to them. And I absolutely agree. So that's wonderful. I really appreciate, we've definitely covered, I have a much better sense, although I have followed you now for a while and talked to you quite a bit. I do have but the way in which you're employing transpersonal integral, connecting it to the other traditional systems, recognizing its benefit, and now bridging around the UTOK structure. It's a really, really fascinating and rich perspective. And I deeply appreciate you bringing it and sharing it with us today.
Yeah, I'm happy for the opportunity. And, I hope, if it, that I think you're familiar with some of it, pretty well familiar with some of it from discussions with Marquis and other people.
Yep.
But yeah, if there's maybe, privately or whatever, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. If there's things that you want to push back on.
Well, in 2 weeks, we'll be able to have some hangout time together. So this will be a good thing for us to pick up, right? We'll be at the Meta Modern Spirituality Conference, and I definitely look forward to, I think there's an enormous amount of synergy. Certainly we can dialogue about where some of maybe my historical skepticism comes in and what's lingering from some aspects of that. But really for me, I feel like I was underdeveloped in this area. And so I'm learning and soaking in and enjoying and finding a lot of the pieces just, falling right into place. So it's more of a curious and growth experience. So
wonderful. Yeah, I love talking to you as always. So yeah, thanks so much for the time.
All right, friend. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Look forward to sharing this with others.
All right, take care.
All right.